Hi, I'm Ellen Halliday, Deputy Editor of Prospect. You're about to watch the interview portion of the latest episode of the Prospect podcast with this week's special guest. For the full episode with additional discussion from Prospect Senior Editor Alona Ferber and myself, click the link in the description below to listen via your favourite podcast app. And if you'd like to read more of Prospect's award-winning journalism, visit prospectmagazine.co.uk. So I'm delighted to welcome now Cas Mudde to the podcast, who's joining us from Georgia in the United States. Cas, thanks so much for being here.
Happy to be here.
Cas, you wrote the cover story for the latest issue of Prospect magazine, and it's kind of looking back on what was a momentous year of elections around the world. Some 2 billion people were eligible to vote in something like 70 countries. And at the start of the year, there was a lot of speculation about how these elections would go, the role of AI, perhaps election interference from some countries in the democratic process of others, and a lot of worry about the health of democracy. And so we gave you the slightly tricky task of looking back at the whole year and assessing how did it go? You know, how healthy is democracy now? What did you conclude? What did you find?
Yeah, I think the year didn't necessarily change that much in terms of the number of countries that are in what is broadly considered to be a crisis of democracy, for the simple fact that whereas the far right did well in many elections, they also will remain in opposition in those countries. And where they were in power, most notably India, they remain in power. Um, if it would have been any other country that changed, it wouldn't have been a major story. But the major change is in the major country, which is the United States. And because the United States is going to change, the world is going to change.
One of the worries was that there would be interference through AI in elections or interference from some countries in other nations' democratic processes. Did that kind of come true, or was that kind of ill-founded concern?
So I didn't necessarily look specifically at that, but the studies that I saw showed very little effect overall. Social media, AI, disinformation, misinformation are terms that are debated endlessly in the media, but to me are always more the symptom or perhaps a catalyst rather than a cause. Like if a society is completely satisfied, you can send whatever misinformation you want, but it won't resonate. The fact that it resonates tells us something about society, right? And so, yes, there's a lot of dissatisfaction for very good reasons. Like, I mean, depending on which country you are, we're in the fifth or third crisis of a still relatively new century. So there are a lot of people who are unhappy, and this can be triggered. But it's not that AI or social media create these kind of things. And as far as I can read the research, it shows that it's a relatively small effect and that there are far more important factors. So I don't think this year changed much. It might in the future.
Yeah. One of the interesting trends that you mentioned is that far right parties did well in countries across the world, even if they're not now in government. And when we were editing this piece and working on it together, we had a bit of a discussion about what the far right is. It can seem quite an abstract term. And maybe some people mix it up with, other historical concepts such as, fascism. And basically, it would be great to know how you define the far right when you're looking at elections now and our kind of contemporary politics.
Um, as that part of the right wing that doesn't subscribe to liberal democracy, very simply stated, liberal democracy is a combination of majority rule and minority rights. And simply stated, the right are all those movements and ideas that believe that inequalities in society are natural and above the purview of the state. Now, within the far right, we usually distinguish between two groups: the extreme right, which is against democracy per se, so against the idea that people elect their own leaders. And we can think here about historical fascism. And then the radical right, which accepts the basis of democracy, that people elect their own leaders, but have problems with liberal aspects of it, like minority rights, separation of powers, independence of media, judiciary. Traditionally, the far right consists almost exclusively of the radical right, but what we have seen over the last, I would say, particularly decade, if not 2 decades, is a radicalization of, on the one hand, mainstream right. And so we have more and more traditionally conservative parties that always had radical right elements, but have now become completely radical right. The Republican Party in the US being a prime example, but you could probably also argue the Conservative Party in Britain, certainly Likud in Israel, or Fidesz of Orban in Hungary. And you have a radicalization of the radical right, in the sense that you have increasingly parties and politicians who claim to support the basis of democracy, but only want to make what is called an illiberal democracy. But at the same time, for example, if you look at what Orban is doing in Hungary, you see that he is not just undermining independence of media and judiciary, but pretty much also trying to take power of the electoral boards, etc. Even more extreme here in the US, where like the whole Republican Party, by and large, rejects the outcome of the most democratic elections, really, in US history, 2020. And so while they say that they're pro-democratic, they do or also say things that go against democracy, which means that the term far right is actually better to describe them, because they're both right, radical right and extreme right. But it is important to note that we have very few extreme right parties in the sense of historical fascism. Like, historical fascism was very clear and open about its rejection of democracy. Ideologically, they didn't believe in the idea that the average man, which at that point in time very much was the man rather than the woman, would elect like their leaders. They believed that there was a supranational, natural leader like Hitler, like Mussolini. Today, the weird thing that we have is we have people undermining democracy allegedly in the name of democracy. And so that is why the term far right these days is increasingly used, because there are more and more actors that have elements of both the extreme right and the radical right.
Yeah. I mean, one of the interesting stories that we saw in this most recent US election campaign was that the fears citizens had about the loss of democracy kind of featured on both sides. Both the Democrats were saying this is the last chance for democracy, and so were the Republicans. What's your take on how important the sense of democracy being under threat was in this most recent US election?
Yeah, that's very difficult, because democracy kind of stands for whatever people want to see in it. And so, yes, it's true that for both camps, and polls showed this, this was very much seen as democracy was at stake. If not, this was the last election that we could still decide on democracy. Now, it's important to note that this has been the case for the last couple of presidential elections in the US. This is not new, and this even predates Trump. It has just become even more extreme. At the same time, when you look at, for example, the Republican base, it's often not so much the system of democracy that's at stake, but it is more the Americanness of the democracy that is at stake. And so they believe, for example, that the American people are being remade through immigration, and to a certain extent through mixtures. Whereas for the Democrats, it's much more about the system as such, and the idea that Trump is going, and the Republican Party is going to reform the system in such a way that it no longer holds the checks and balances at the very least. So there are different interpretations of what democracy mean, but it was very important to both of them.
Yeah. How much of a threat do you think the second Trump presidency will pose to democracy? Are the fears many on the liberal side have well founded, or are those checks and balances strong enough?
Yeah, I try not to speculate or catastrophize because it doesn't help us much, and it's certainly not empowering. Um, I've argued that Trump 2.0 will be much more problematic for democracy and the world than Trump 1.0 for a variety of reasons. Most importantly, there is a plan which is called Project 2025, which everyone with half a brain cell knew was going to be the plan. And Trump has now embraced it, of course. Um, as important, there are no serious counterpowers anymore to Trump, not just within the Republican Party, but within the broader conservative movement. Leaving aside that they have what's called a unified government here with both houses of Congress. Of course, they already controlled the Supreme Court. Um, that is, I mean, that's a significant threat. At the same time, um, government is never unified, and under whatever government, the various agencies will work against each other. On top of that, the coalition that Trump brings together is still very broad. Now, none of them is particularly concerned about liberal democracy, but they also don't want the other one to have all the power. And there is a lot of incompetence in the people that are being appointed, as well as just the usual stickiness of bureaucracy, right? So even if you push through plans that will create, in theory, a completely different system, they still have to be implemented. And so I think that we're going to see a much more comprehensive attack on liberal democracy. But at the same time, we're also going to see chaos and corruption, which will mean that a lot of these plans are going to be either not implemented or only partially implemented. And the real question, and what we really should focus on, is not so much all the red meat that is being thrown to the base about transgender rights or borders, which are incredibly important, and we should look at that. But more important for the long term is what is being done with regard to elections. And the Republican Party, and to be fair, the Democratic Party too, but much further away, has a very long history of voter intimidation and voter suppression. And we have seen an increase of that in the run up to the 2024 elections. It will be even worse in 2026 for the midterms. And if the Democrats do poorly in the midterms, the 2028 elections are going to be almost completely controlled by the Republican Party. And then we get into a situation like, for example, in Hungary, where you just have free and unfair elections, which are much easier to win.
I mean, this is interesting because one of the kind of points of the piece was to say, there's been a long history of journalists like us here at Prospect, as well as, some researchers saying that democracy is doomed. And in your piece, you kind of argue that actually electoral democracy, that there are many of them, but there is a threat to liberal democracy. I mean, it sounds there as though you're painting a pretty bleak picture about the future of the health of American democracy. The threats are very real, right?
Yeah, the threats are very real. It's also important to remember that the United States, not the world. Um, there is a very significant threat in the US. The threat is even worse in India and Hungary, but it's much less the case, for example, in Germany or um, I mean, let alone Ireland. So it's not all the same, right? And I think one of the key points of the piece is that we are here not because of some determinism, be it historical or economic or social. We're here because of choices made by the most privileged part of our society, the political elites, the media elites, and to a certain extent the economic elites. They have chosen to rather collaborate with the far right than oppose them. And that in certain countries, they can still make better choices. I mean, it seems, for example, that Ireland has done that by responding to the anti-immigration riots, by talking about immigration, but not centralizing it and not all adopting the positions of the far right. At the same time, we see, for example, in the UK, that Starmer is largely just copying the position of the far right, even going to Italy to learn from far right Prime Minister Meloni. And we know from literally decades of research that copying the issues and the frames and the positions of the far right will not weaken the far right, not in the short term and certainly not in the long term. And so, yes, it's bleak, but it's bleak. It's much bleaker for certain countries than for others. And again, it's also important. Certain, I mean, roughly stated, the elites have led us into this situation. Technically, they can still take us out of there. But at the same time, we are democratic societies. And that means that the people have also a role to play here, right? And so it's easy to say, well, the media is all the time writing stories about the far right and giving them voice. But if we don't read these stories, the media is not going to print them because the media are businesses. And so I think we all have to take our own responsibility in how much or how little we have contributed to the normalization of the far right.
Mm. I mean, one of the other things that you say is you mention kind of a series of crises, whether that's the Great Recession after 2008-9, the COVID pandemic, and um, you say that it wasn't inevitable that the far right would be the kind of political grouping that would profit from these crises and be able to turn that into kind of electoral success. Could you explain a bit more about why you or how you think groups outside the far right might draw on those crises to engage with electorates?
Yeah. So we have had 9/11. We had the so called refugee crisis. We had the Great Recession. We had COVID. And now we have Ukraine, Russia. At least three of them have affected pretty much the whole world. But if you focus purely on the global north, then almost all five have been affected. Now, you can make narratives that make it logical that, for example, 9/11, as well as the so called refugee crisis of 2015-16, would benefit the far right. But a crisis is always a creation. First of all, for something to become a crisis is kind of a choice. And then there is a narrative around that crisis. So 9/11 became about Islam, but it could also have been about a disgruntled shadow elite, for example. The so called refugee crisis became, again, a crisis about immigrants threatening national society identity and security. It could also have been a humanitarian crisis. So the narrative that we spin around something is a political struggle. And in it, we have seen that the far right has been very strong and very successful, but it has been largely successful because the rest is so weak, because the rest didn't push back. And why don't they push back? because it's much easier to find a narrative if you have an overarching ideology. The far right has a clear ideology. It believes that security and prosperity is dependent upon a homogeneous national unit. And so anything that threatens the world. Much of the so-called liberal democratic parties, from Christian democracies to social democracy, don't have an ideology anymore. They're mostly pragmatic. They're mostly looking at things in terms of TINA politics. There is no alternative. And they, as a consequence, what they do is they let others define the issue and then look for rational, in scare quotes, solutions to it. But as a consequence, they're solving the so called problems that are defined by others, most notably the far right. And I think in this sense, it is particularly the weakness of the left is very important, which was thrown a lifeline by COVID 19. COVID 19 made even neoliberals like former Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte say that it showed the importance of the state. And so, after decades of dominance of neoliberalism, like both COVID 19 and Russia Ukraine crisis showed the importance of the state, which generally is the purview of the left. And nevertheless, there was no narrative around it, there was no clear story. And as soon as there was anything else on the agenda, most notably immigration, far right starts to shout, generally the media starts to amplify, and everyone starts to respond, either positively or negatively, but that doesn't matter. Because as long as you talk about their issues in their frames, you build them up. And so for me, this is very much a crisis of ideology. To a certain extent, there's one ideology that has at the moment the momentum, which is nativism, which is the far right. And even neoliberalism, which still largely defines our system, has kind of lost its ideological momentum as a consequence of the Great Recession. And so we run pretty much from crisis to crisis, where the crises are largely defined by the far right. And let me be clear, the far right doesn't dominate everything, right? The far right doesn't dominate the debate about Russia, Ukraine, for example, where it has mostly actually followed the mainstream. But it does define anything related to immigration. And immigration defines most of our politics over the last 2 decades.
How capable do you think the centre left or the left, more generally, is at sort of reshaping that and trying to regain that ability to create a story?
So overall, not capable at all. I also make a distinction between, let's say, the left social democracy as social democratic parties and social democratic ideology. I think social democratic parties are first and foremost concerned with their own survival. Many have very little comprehension of what social democracy is and are deeply affected by New Labour and believe that is actually social democracy. Remember that most of the people who lead social democratic parties today joined during the heydays of New Labour. And so I believe that the revitalization of the left will have to come outside of these parties. But even there, you don't see that much. I don't see much of a vibrant discussion. There was a little bit of a moment around Corbyn, for example, which came with various issues. You see here in the US actually a reasonably vibrant discussion, even with some inspiring politicians, most notably AOC. At the same time, part of this discussion is about things that have been kind of mainstream policies in Europe for decades, right? So, but somehow the center left social democracy has lost belief in itself. And I feel that's the same with, for example, the European Union, and a lot of liberal democracy. There's this idea that like our narrative, we have to write analysis, we have to write policies, but the people don't get that. The people just follow the populists, right? And at the basis, this is distrust of democracy, right? I mean, if you believe that the people don't make the right decisions, then why do you support the democratic system? I don't think that the people are. First of all, I don't think the people exist outside of being a very heterogeneous unit. I also don't think that every election creates the best possible outcome. But I do believe that in the vast majority of democratic systems, the majority of the people support liberal democracy. But for that, they also need leaders. They need people who believe in liberal democracy, who understand that liberal democracy is not just majority rule, but also the protection of minorities, that are capable of explaining this to the people and explaining why liberal democracy is the best system. And that I miss at the moment. I mean, there is just no fundamental other view. And again, I often go back to the Brexit referendum because the Brexit referendum was the best example of the absolute failure of a positive narrative. You had an empowering narrative, which was Brexit, which was about taking power back. And whether it's right or wrong, like whether it's possible or not, is irrelevant. It promised something, it empowered people. And on the other hand, you had Remain, which by and large just said, don't do what they say because that's terrible. Like, I mean, most of the Remain camp didn't even speak about the European Union, like about what it is. And so we do that. Like, we don't defend liberal democracy. We just say that fascism is worse, right? That is the narrative today. And while that might be true, and while probably a lot of people also believe that, they either think that the other side is actually also democratic, or they believe that while the other one might be bad, they know already that the current system is bad because they are like responsible for the policies that they have seen in their lifetime.
You mentioned AOC and there being some examples in kind of the American left of political leaders who kind of offer a different kind of story for the left. Are there other examples internationally where you think someone is making that positive case?
Not not that I know, which doesn't mean that they are not there. It just means that I don't know them, which also means that they haven't been promoted much in the international media because I do at times read the news. I see sometimes promising leaders of youth branches of social democratic parties, and then the closer they come to becoming serious in the real party, they moderate and kind of disappear. I think for me, social democracy is not just about socioeconomics, right? I mean, there is this idea that, for example, wokeness lost Harris the election, which is insanity, because there was nothing woke specifically about the Harris campaign. Um, I believe that socioeconomic progress and social cultural progress cannot be separated. And so you cannot create socioeconomic equality without dealing with gender discrimination, with sexual discrimination, etc., etc. So if you want, like, with wokeness, like that is just part of it. And I think it is important to note that with regard to race and I would say sexuality, gender, the debate in the US is miles ahead of most of the debates in Europe. Like even we had a candidate who is in the European media always described as like really old and centrist, if not right wing, Joe Biden, who championed openly and consistently transgender rights. Now, give me an example of any leader, including social democrats, um, in Europe who did that. The embrace of multiculturalism here, for example, is unlike anything in Europe. And yes, the Democrats have made far too many concessions on the border, but at the same time still stand openly for a multicultural, or if you want, multiracial America, which is something that in my own country, the Netherlands, I don't see many parties have. And so I think that there is, particularly with regard to the US, Europe feels very superior, which I fully understand. I do as well. But Europe is also kind of missing that, particularly the European left, is living in an artificial world. That consensus that they think is still there, that is social democratic, that is multicultural, etc., that doesn't exist anymore. And it has to be recreated, but it has to be recreated in a way that is fitting for the 21st century. So no longer based implicitly on white supremacy, patriarchy, heteronormativity, but actually truly engaging with the inclusion of all these other groups. And it is stunning how few, particularly older white men like myself, like are willing to go there. Like they're fine with tolerating others, right? But tolerating is still hierarchical. This is not about tolerating. This is about arguing that women, transgender people, gay people, whatever they are, right? They are as much part of our society as we white men or white women.
I think we're going to have to end the conversation there as we're running out of time, but that's been an absolutely fascinating conclusion to this discussion, and thank you so much for sharing that perspective and also giving us on this side of the Atlantic something else to think about in terms of our relationship with America. So thank you very much for joining the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.